I was watching television when my daughter-in-law walked into the living room, took the remote from my hand, and turned the screen black. "Go to your room," she said. Her voice was sharp, practiced. "This is my space now. We pay the bills now," she said. "So this is our space." For a moment, no one moved. The silence felt heavier than the words. I stayed quiet. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I looked past her, toward the kitchen doorway, where my son was standing. He had heard everything. I know that because his shoulders stiffened, just slightly, before he looked down at his phone. He said nothing. That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough for me to feel myself slide out of place in a house I had lived in for decades. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created by the Her Chains channel team, based on real-life situations to convey lessons about family, emotions, and human values. All characters and events are illustrative. My name is Marjorie Hale. I am 68. The evening news had always been my time. Not because it mattered so much, but because it was familiar. I sat in the same chair every night, at the same hour, holding the same remote. After my husband died, that routine stayed. It grounded me. It reminded me that some things still belonged to me. That night, I was halfway through a story I had already heard before. I was not doing anything wrong. I was not loud. I was not in anyone's way. My daughter-in-law did not ask me to turn the television down. She did not ask how much longer I would be. She simply decided I was finished. When she spoke, it was not anger I heard. It was certainty. I waited, just a second longer than was comfortable. I turned fully toward my son. I gave him time to step in, to say something small, something simple. He could have said, "That's not okay." He could have said my name. Instead, he scrolled. I felt foolish for waiting. I felt older than I had that morning. I placed the remote on the table. My hands were steady, though my chest felt tight. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and picked up my keys from the small dish by the door. No one followed me. No one stopped me. I did not slam the door when I left. I closed it the way I always had, carefully, quietly. As I stepped outside, I did not know where I was going. I only knew that I was not staying where I had just been told I no longer belonged. I did not drive far before I had to pull over. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same image: my son standing in the doorway, phone in hand, eyes down. When he was little, silence meant he was hiding something: a broken lamp, a bad grade. He would go quiet and wait for the moment to pass. I told myself that was what I had just seen: habit, fear, nothing more. But the longer I sat there, the harder it was to believe. Earlier that evening, I had turned toward him and said nothing at all. I had not accused him. I had not begged. I had only looked at him and waited. He knew that look. He had grown up with it. It meant I was giving him space to do the right thing. He didn't take it. Not now. He had muttered, not to me, but to the room. His eyes never left the screen. "Can we just not do this?" "Not do what?" "Stand up, speak, acknowledge me." I had wanted to say his name. I had wanted to remind him that this was my house, that I was his mother, that I was still here, but something stopped me. I realized then that if I spoke first, his silence would stay invisible. If I filled the space, he wouldn't have to. So I stayed quiet. That was when his silence changed shape. It stopped being hesitation and became a choice. My daughter-in-law had crossed her arms and said, "See, it's fine," like the matter was settled. And it was. Not because she had power, but because no one challenged her claim to it. I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. The balance in that house had already shifted. I had just been the last one to notice. When I placed the remote down and picked up my keys, I felt it happen fully. The room did not wait for me. It did not pause. My absence did not register as a loss. My son didn't call out. He didn't ask where I was going, He didn't follow me to the doors. That silence walked beside me all the way to the car. It sat in the passenger seat as I started the engine. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was alignment. I've argued before. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough to be heard. The first time I tried, my son sighed and said, "Mom, you're overthinking this." The second time, my daughter-in-law smiled thinly and said, "You're being dramatic." After that, it became easier for everyone if I just let things go. That night, all of it came back to me at once. I knew what would happen if I argued. My voice would rise just enough to be used against me. My words would be trimmed down later into something simpler, emotional, unreasonable. Another example of why I was hard to live with. I also knew what wouldn't happen. No one would suddenly listen. When my daughter-in-law told me to go to my room, she wasn't inviting a discussion, she was closing one. If I argued, I would be playing the role she'd already assigned me. So I didn't. I stood there long enough to show I'd heard her. Then I looked at my son one last time. He still didn't meet my eyes. That told me everything I needed to know. I picked up my keys. I didn't announce where I was going. I didn't explain myself. I didn't ask permission. Leaving without a scene was the only choice that still belonged to me. I drove without thinking too much about where I was going. Muscle memory took over. I ended up at a small motel near the harbor, the kind of place you don't plan to stay, but remember when you need it. The clerk looked up when I stepped to the counter. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. One night, he said, "Yes," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He slid a key card toward me. "Breakfast is at 6. Coffee's always on. Thank you," I said. And meant it more than I should have. The room was clean, plain, and unfamiliar. The bedspread was tucked too tightly. The lamp buzzed faintly when I turned it on. I set my purse on the chair and stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. At home, I would have known exactly where everything went. I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my shoes. My phone vibrated in my hand. A message from my son. "Where are you?" he texted like he didn't want anyone to hear him ask. That was all. No apology, no mention of what had happened. Just a question. Like I'd misplaced myself. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and left it there. I changed into my nightclothes slowly, folding each piece as if I were a guest in my own life. I brushed my teeth at the sink, watching a woman in the mirror who looked older than she had that morning. Not weaker, just more aware. When I lay down, the bed felt too big and not mine. The room was quiet in a way my house never was anymore. No footsteps. No television. No voices claiming space that used to be shared. I waited for tears. They didn't come. Instead, there was a stillness I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't relief. It was the calm that comes when you finally stop pretending something hasn't already changed. I slept lightly, waking once to the sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall. When morning came, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing I had crossed a line I wouldn't be able to step back over. By morning, the quiet had done its work. When my son first asked if they could stay with me, he said it would be temporary, just until we get back on our feet. He told me, I believed him because I wanted to. I said yes, because that's what mothers do. At first, it was small things. Boxes left in the hallway, groceries moved without asking, my chair taken because it was closer to the outlet. When I mentioned it, my daughter-in-law said, "It's easier this way." Like ease was the same as permission. I told myself it was fine. When the kitchens started running on their schedule, I adjusted mine. When conversations happened without me, I stayed quiet. When decisions were made in my house as if I were a guest, I learned to wait. Every time I thought about pushing back, my son would say, "Let's not make this a thing," so I didn't, sitting there alone. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Nothing had been taken all at once. It had been handed over, piece by piece, with my cooperation. I had called it patience. I had called it peace. The television wasn't the problem. It was the proof. The moment she turned it off wasn't sudden. It was simply the first time she said out loud what everyone else had already accepted, that the shared spaces were no longer shared, that my presence was optional. I hadn't been pushed out of my place. I had stepped aside so often that no one noticed when I was gone. My phone buzzed while I was buttoning my coat. A message from my son lit the screen. "Where are you?" That was all. No acknowledgement of the night before. No mention of what his wife had said. No apology. Just a question. Like I'd stepped out without telling him and he was mildly inconvenienced. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it again. I imagined replying,
"I could have said, I needed space. I could have said, you heard what she said to me. I could have said his name and waited for him to remember who I was. Instead, I set the phone down. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. Are you okay?" The words were careful. Still no responsibility. Still no ownership. He was checking a box, not opening a door. I didn't answer that one either. The silence felt different this time. It wasn't the kind that swallowed me. It held its shape.
It stayed where I put it. Another message came through. "We should talk." I almost laughed at that. We had talked plenty. We just hadn't said the things that mattered. I stood up and slipped my phone into my bag, face down. For years, silence had belonged to him. He used it to avoid arguments, to let moments pass, to wait until problems smoothed themselves over without his involvement. This time, it belonged to me. By the time I stepped outside, my phone was quiet. I knew he would notice. I knew he wouldn't like it. The absence of my reply would do what my words never had. It would make him uncomfortable enough to move. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about that. I'd paid with my card. I forgot that meant the address would show up on our shared banking alerts. He arrived the next morning without calling first. I was standing near the window when I saw his car pull in. He sat there for a moment before getting out, hands on the steering wheel, shoulders tight. When he finally knocked, it wasn't confident. It was careful. I opened the door. He didn't step forward. "Mom," he said, like it was a test. "You didn't answer me. I saw your messages. I said." He exhaled. "I didn't know where you went. I left." I said, "You were there." He shifted his weight. "I thought you just needed to cool off." "From what?" I asked evenly. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "That's not what I meant." "You meant it would pass." I said, "It usually does." He stepped inside without asking, then stopped short, as if unsure he was welcome. He looked around. "Not at me." "She's upset," he said. "She thinks you took it the wrong way." "I didn't take it." I said, "I heard it." His jaw tightened. "You know how she is. I know how you are." I said, "That landed." He finally looked at me, eyes sharp with something close to panic. "I came because you wouldn't answer." He said, "I didn't know what you were thinking." "I was thinking you watched it happen," I said, and said nothing. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I didn't want to make it worse." "For who?" I said. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower. "I didn't want another fight." "So you let her speak for you," I said. "And for me." He looked down. "I didn't think you'd leave. I didn't think you'd stay quiet," I said. He stood there, caught between what he'd done and what he was finally seeing. I could tell then why he'd come. Not because he understood, because the house felt different without me in it, and that scared him more than my hurt ever had. We sat across from each other without touching the chairs. The space between us felt earned. I didn't leave to punish you. I said, I left because I understood something I hadn't before. He nodded once, like he was bracing himself. I know you were hurt. I said, but that wasn't the reason. He frowned. Then why? Because I waited. I said, I waited for you to speak. His shoulders dropped slightly. He didn't interrupt. I stood there after she told me to go to my room. I went on. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I looked at you and gave you time. You've always asked for time. He swallowed. I didn't know what to say. You knew what not to say. I replied, you chose that. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want it to turn into a fight. So you let it turn into silence, I said. And that silence spoke very clearly. He looked at the floor. I thought if I stayed out of it, things would calm down. They did, I said, just not the way you hoped. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was afraid. Of what? I asked. Of upsetting her, he admitted. Of going home to another argument. Of choosing sides. There was already a side. I said, you just didn't name it. He pressed his lips together, eyes wet but steady. I didn't think you'd feel pushed out. I didn't feel pushed. I said, I felt replaced. That landed harder. He looked up at me then. Really looked. I never meant for that to happen. I know. I said, but intent doesn't erase impact. He nodded again. Slower this time. When you didn't answer my messages, he said, I realized how much I depend on you staying where I put you. I didn't soften that truth for him. I don't need you to choose me over your wife. I said, but I do need you to stop letting someone else speak for you and for me. He sat there, breathing through it, finally understanding that this wasn't a moment to smooth over. It was a moment to face what his silence had cost. We went back to the house that afternoon. He told her to come into the living room. He asked her to come in after we finished talking. She walked into the room like she still owned it, shoulders squared, eyes already sharp. I don't understand why this is such a big deal, she said. Before either of us spoke, I told you. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He didn't look at me first. He looked at her. We need to be clear, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady in a way I hadn't heard before. What you said to my mother wasn't okay. Her expression froze. Just for a second. I was just asking for space, she replied. You know how important my routine is. This isn't about routine, he said. It's about how you spoke to her. And where? She crossed her arms. So now I'm the problem. No, he said. But this is... He gestured toward the living room, toward the chair I'd always sat in, toward the television she'd turned off without asking. This is shared space. It always has been. She laughed once, short and incredulous. You can't be serious. I am, he said, and it's not a discussion. I watched her face change as the words settled. Confusion gave way to something sharper. She looked at me then, like she was seeing me for the first time, measuring how much ground she'd lost. You didn't say anything that night. She said to him, you just stood there. I know, he replied, and that was my mistake. The room went quiet. Not the heavy silence I'd carried before, but a clean one. We'll respect boundaries going forward, he continued. That includes how we speak to each other. Especially you speaking to my mother. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands dropped to her sides. The certainty she'd walked in with was gone. I reached for the remote and set it back on the table where it belonged. No one stopped me. No one argued. She stood there, stunned not because she'd been confronted, but because the silence she'd relied on was no longer on her side. I came back before dinner, not because I was apologizing, but because it was my address. I walked into the living room later that evening without announcing myself. My son looked up from the couch and stood. You can sit, he said, not as an offer, As a correction, I nodded and took my place in the chair. No one clapped. No one smiled. That felt right. We need to be clear going forward, he said, glancing between us. This is still Mom's home. Shared spaces stay shared, and respect isn't optional. His wife didn't argue. She nodded once. Tight-lipped. Understood. I didn't add anything. I didn't need to. The boundary had been spoken. My silence now wasn't erasure. It was confirmation. My son hesitated, then asked, "Is there anything else you need?" "Yes," I said, "for you to speak when it matters. Even if it's uncomfortable." He swallowed. "I will." I reached for the remote and turned the television back on myself. The sound filled the room. Steady and familiar. I didn't look at either of them while I did it. Later, when the house quieted, my son lingered in the doorway. "I'm sorry it took me this long." He said, "I know." I replied, "Just don't make me wait again." He nodded and went to bed. I stayed where I was, watching the screen, feeling the weight of the day settle into something calmer. What I learned was simple and hard-earned. Keeping the peace should never cost you your place. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this matter because they remind us that dignity isn't loud and boundaries are a form of love.